In the last episode, I left you with the question, will longevity breakthroughs cause a population boom? Well, not to worry. As a permaculture urbanist old guy, I've got you covered. In today's episode, I'll be covering why there were past fears of a population boom, how that has evolved into a surprising present threat, and, of course, city planning for a longevity boom. Welcome to Edenicity, best practices for sustainably abundant cities. Now, when I was born, there were 3.3 billion people on the planet, and today there are over 8 billion of us. And when you look back over the history of Earth's human population, recent centuries have been quite a ride. Why has our population exploded? Well, mainly due to advances in public health, things like sanitation and hygiene, as well as, of course, advancements in healthcare. These have come with a whole host of problems that we're all too familiar with these days. Resource shortages, environmental damage, inequality, famine, disease, crime, and war. Thomas Malthus pointed these out in 1898, and several books have been written about them in the mid to late 20th century. Pictured in the background is a still from Soylent Green. Perhaps the most shocking thing about the film was that nearly everybody seemed to be homeless, which when the film came out in 1973 was something you just didn't see every day. But for nations, this was deadly serious business. The problem was getting out of hand quickly. Leaders felt intense pressure to do something about it. To try to mitigate, that is to say prevent, a population boom, China instituted a one-child policy in 1979 that persisted until 2015. In the 80s and 90s, teenage mothers and welfare mothers were publicly shamed by just about every politician there was. In my immediate social circle, I dated a couple of women who were adamantly dedicated to zero population growth, and I knew other couples that were committed to negative population growth, meaning that all of them chose to have no children whatsoever because of the tremendous burden of population pressure in the world. But by then it was starting to become clear that urban populations were generally less fertile than rural populations, and that human rights also seemed to decrease fertility, especially women's rights, when it came to equal access to jobs, education, and healthcare. Now, how can cities adapt to the fact of a growing population? From an urbanist perspective, the very first thing you need to do is find more space in your urban environments. And the best way to do that is through mass transit, rather than dedicating anywhere from 25 to 80% of the surface area of cities to streets, parking lots, parking spaces, setbacks, and other responses to cars. Providing affordable housing is critical to maintain the overall level of health and safety in a city. Cities have been taking this seriously for a really long time as well. Cities experiencing a population boom sometimes do try to limit immigration, usually without success. And finally, cities can use permaculture, which is an ecological home food design system with about 1 million certified designers worldwide, to reverse the environmental harms of soil degradation from mechanized and chemical agriculture in the large landscapes that serve cities. From 1890 to 1930, New York City grew from 1.5 million to 6.9 million people. During the early days of the boom, landlords could make enormous amounts of money subdividing apartments so that you had up to 15 people in a small room, often without ventilation or light. This led to lots of disease, and in the late 1800s through the early 1900s, New York City passed a whole range of tenement reforms that acted as basically building and landlord-tenant codes that required housing to actually be livable. This dropped the death rate about 33% in 15 years. The clatter of horses was deafening, the manure in the streets was a public health hazard, and the blizzard of 1888 ground the whole city to a halt. So in that year, the city began planning and construction of its subway system. This was a necessary move to accommodate the growth that it was just starting to face. Now, intense though New York's growth was, Hong Kong's was worse. Its population grew threefold from 1947 through 49, and then 1 to 4% per year through 2002. And just to give you a sense of how intense that is, in my lifetime, the United States has never grown by more than 1.4% a year. And on this scale, Hong Kong's growth for over half a century was up here at the 2% line. Hong Kong adapted to this intense population growth through land reclamation, that is to say dredging and extending their shoreline, building public housing, which houses 43% of the population today, mostly in rental flats, and building a mass transit railway, and in recent decades, a strategy of transit-oriented development. That is to say, apartments over malls over train stations that we see today. And this is the pattern that Hong Kong Kong is used to keep its landscape 76% green. Now, another green city, Singapore, has grown by a factor of 3 since 1965 and has also adapted to its population growth through land reclamation, public housing, which in their case accounts for 81% of the population, as well as mass rapid transit and the ethnic integration policy of 1989. But after all that growth and all those adaptations and mitigations, something unexpected happened. Throughout the world, increasingly in ever more nations, we're encountering a fertility decline. This happens when there's more deaths than births, when the number of live births per woman per lifetime falls below a replacement rate of 2.1. Why isn't it 2.0? There's slightly more boys than girls born in the world, and not everybody ends up fertile. Surprisingly enough, the United States has been below its replacement rate since 1973, and all nations are trending down. When I was born, the fertility rate was almost 3. By 1973, it was below the replacement rate, and it hit an all-time low in 1978, and it has never quite returned to replacement rate in all that time since then. Here's an all-nation view of the same phenomenon. In the 1950s, the fertility rates just about everywhere, from the richest nations to the poorest, was well above the replacement rate, shown here in the dotted line. But as we move forward in time, the rich nations, pictured in green here, fell below replacement in the mid-1970s, followed by the rest of the Central European nations by 1990, with ever more nations falling below replacement as time moves forward. In this graph, you might pay attention to the orange line, which is the global fertility rate, and that falls below the replacement rate in the early 2030s. These are estimates pulling together many data sets, which are always changing. So this indicates but doesn't define the situation that we're looking at. Now, you might wonder, well, what's wrong with a fertility decline? Doesn't this give the environment a break? Maybe it does, but it also comes with severe worker shortages, a lack of caregivers for an aging population, and economic contraction and shortages. But the question is, why has fertility fallen so sharply all over the world? There's no shortage of theories, but one thing's for certain. Women are starting to delay childbirth. Back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way till almost the present moment, women in their 20s had more than twice as many babies as women in their 30s. They still have the majority of babies, but the gap really is closing. Not because women in their 30s are having that many more children. They aren't. But because more and more women in their 20s are now choosing not to. When we compare today to the peak in 1960 by bracket, you can see that teens are getting pregnant 81% less frequently than they used to. Women in their early 20s, only a quarter as frequently, and women in their later 20s, half as frequently. The numbers haven't really changed that much for women in their 30s and 40s, although the overall trend is down. But why is this happening? People have debated it in the literature for decades, but in my very non-statistical daily life, the reason I hear most frequently is the very high cost of having children, at least in the United States. A lot of Americans are feeling left behind in the economy. One of the things that you'll hear are concerns about inflation. So let's take a look at inflation in the past. This is a table of historical inflation rates. What you're seeing across these rows are the year-on-year inflations. This 1.0 is 1% increase in the cost of most goods compared to January of the year before. So when we look at this year-on-year inflation for each month, you can see that inflation was really low in the 50s and started to rise only in the mid to late 60s, starting to get up to some scary numbers right around 1970, 71, after which it got a lot worse. 74, 75, 76, 77. We're looking at 11.3, 12.1, 12.2. Just to put this in perspective, comparing that to the inflation that we all felt a couple of years back, that peaked at 9.1 in the middle of 2022. Whereas eventually, around 1980, it got up around 14%. And that was just about the lowest point of American fertility. Does fertility always trade off against inflation? Of course not. But costs and the sense that you're falling behind in society definitely contribute to young people's reluctance to have children. On a related note, with more women in the workforce, children can come at a significant opportunity cost. As Fads showed in a recent video that I'll link in the description, having a child had very little impact on a man's earnings, but substantial impact on women's earnings. The 2020 census generally agreed with this, but did point out that for women early in their careers, the earnings quickly returned to normal levels. That also showed this really wild chart that showed how fertility really fell off in countries like South Korea, where the household duties of women who are in the workforce are still expected to be some 4.5 times as much as those of men. And as a result, many Korean women are literally opting out of those roles altogether. Like I said, this is a fraught topic for individuals and nations. It's literally existential so people are bound to be triggered one way or the other. A perfect example of this is a trend of declining male fertility, which has only recently been recognized by the U.S. Census Bureau after decades of tracking female fertility. Now, to be fair, it's much harder to track male fertility. Birth records are relatively easy to obtain, while sperm counts are not. The data are relatively inconsistent and in some cases biased because the sources can include, for example, fertility clinics, which have a low fertility selection bias built into them. Anyway, it's been speculated that if indeed male fertility is falling, pesticides and other chemicals in our environment might be acting as endocrine disruptors, which is to say they interfere with male hormones. This is so hotly debated that there was no mention of endocrine disruption in the Census Bureau report. So it's a possible factor. Finally, one of the most hotly debated contributions to a fertility decline is our biological responses to crowding. There's been an active debate on this since the 1970s because, according to these authors, studies of crowding in lower animals routinely demonstrate that compressed living conditions depress the ability of the species to reproduce. But when they studied a sample of 470 urban Toronto women, they found that crowding did not influence fertility or infant survival. But it's such a plausible theory that the debate has raged on for decades. There are some interesting nuances. For example, this study that appeared just earlier this year looks at different kinds of crowding and people's responses to it. So, for example, looking at single-family housing versus multifamily versus group quarters such as dormitories, the author found that multifamily housing had an advantage up to 2 bedrooms, but delivered almost the same fertility as multifamily housing, that is to say apartments and townhouses, for 3 bedrooms and above. He also showed that when you have lots of apartments stacked vertically in a really dense city, the crowding within each apartment really started to matter. So people living in the least crowded apartments in low-density cities had average fertility, but it rose to well above replacement rate when they felt that they had lots of space within their apartments in the densest cities. But this was the most impressive chart. This is a plot of fertility vertically versus living situation. People living without parents in red, people living with their parents in blue. And in all but a very few situations, there was much higher fertility among people who were not living with their parents. He calls this nearly a cross-cultural universal that living with parents is associated with lower birth rates. So let's keep this in mind as we look at how cities and nations can mitigate and adapt to a fertility decline. A mitigation would be any effort to boost fertility and end the decline. Singapore, which has a fairly severe fertility crisis with birth rates well below replacement, has long had a policy of building public housing flats to order for married couples. As I discuss in my book, Housing in 4 Cities, singles can buy public housing flats too, but only when they're 35 years old and above, and they need to buy those flats on the resale market, which can cost up to twice as much as a built-to-order flat. Since most young singles in Singapore live with their parents, this housing policy, which is meant to prioritize and incentivize young families, ends up setting up the conditions for singles to have difficulty getting together in the first place, which is why it might be wise for Singapore and other nations looking to bring their fertility rates up to really look at creating affordable housing for young people so they can have their own place and start their own lives at an earlier age. This is especially true for young women who are at their peak fertility. Now, these are very triggering topics, and opinions differ strongly on all of these points, especially the next mitigation, which would be fertility and longevity treatments, which are somewhat separate medical considerations for men, but may be more intertwined for women. In fact, according to this study, it may be possible not only for women to recover their fertility later in life, but for that recovery to increase women's lifespan. In other words, regenerating ovaries may offer another pathway toward longevity for women in the future. This is why the next mitigation, greater equality of access to education, healthcare, and jobs, especially for women, is also a way to overcome a fertility decline. When I attended college, women accounted for 25% of the bachelor's degrees in the physical sciences. But a few years later, when that number had nearly doubled, I was amazed at the quality of the students at a UCLA astronomy club, which was half women. The questions, the engagement was substantially better than I had encountered just 15 years before. Having a larger swath of society involved in innovation and research will speed progress in all areas, including improving fertility and longevity in the long run. I know I made this point in the previous video, but I can't emphasize this enough. This is a fundamental human resource that is wasted too often at present. And the final mitigation, this won't surprise you, is permaculture urbanism, that is to say Edenicity, because local organic gardens dramatically reduce the amount of endocrine disruptors found in pesticides that we encounter in our food daily. That, of course, would mitigate losses in male fertility. How can cities adapt to lower fertility? Well, of course, immigration, especially from rural areas, would help to shore up the labor shortages. Automation could play a role in the long run. And Edenicity, with its car-free, multifamily garden-to-cafe design, would improve affordability, safety, and health, and make for a more compact, accessible urban footprint that would take the edge off of depopulation. And there are over 100 videos on this channel that deal with these changes. And of course, the garden-to-cafe culture does a lot to bring people together to combat the loneliness epidemics that can occur with low fertility. All right, what about the longevity boom? There are many pathways, including medical research and lifestyle changes, but there's really two types of longevity that we're looking at. The one is increasing our lifespan without increasing our health span. That is to say, prolonging old age and all the care it requires, which could very well lead to caregiver shortages. A longer lifespan also gives personal investments more time to grow, leading to ever greater amounts of inequality. The bottom line for a type 1 longevity boom is that ever more and more people leave the workforce and need care. And some of them will have money, but no longer play a productive role in the workforce. These are serious problems faced by virtually all of the rich nations today. The second type of longevity boom is what everyone's working on really hard right now. This is where our health span grows along with our lifespan. In this case, we remain vigorous and potentially productive for many years in what would otherwise be considered old age. Because we would remain healthy during this time, there really is no economic need for retirement, but we run even greater risks of inequality in two ways. First of all, because investments made over time have a longer period of time to grow, and the exponential growth of investments looks very much like that population curve that I showed you right at the beginning of this video. The rich will get much richer in this scenario. As they get wealthier, if they choose to work, they will have the opportunity to grow their skills over many, many decades, and just the skill gaps between the young and the old will also create a second type of inequality. Unfortunately, in our winner-take-all society, increased inequality would shut more and more people out of the innovation game that would be so necessary to continue to grow our health span along with our lifespan. And of course, inequality is the source of so much suffering and crime in our world. So the mitigations are pretty obvious. We need to dramatically increase taxes on assets and capital. And rather than dismantling Social Security, it would probably evolve into something like a universal basic income, plus applying for and receiving disability benefits, which we would probably see more of as people encounter accidents and health problems that are not yet addressed by medical progress. If longevity comes at the expense of fertility, one way to counter that effect would be to adjust the vesting age for universal basic income downward so that young people have more resources when they're fertile. Now, you're probably wondering, wait a minute, would this really work? The beauty of Edenicity is that it is city scale, so that it does not commit entire nations to new policies. Every city will probably go its own way, making its own choices. And if they stay in good communication, I believe it will rapidly become clear how each of these mitigations and others that I can't even imagine right now would work out. But the question is, how would cities adapt to a longevity boom? Unlike a population boom where they might resist immigration, I think the answer is that cities will always be competing for talent. Urbanization brings so many forces that reduce fertility that I believe that a population boom is not going to be a threat, even if we have extreme longevity. So what will happen with cities is that they'll start competing for talent as they do today by becoming destinations of choice where people can be fertile and become talented. Now, as we're starting to see around the world, cities like Paris are starting to do car-free experiments very rapidly. We're going to start seeing transit-oriented development and urban gardening to table culture emerge, which will be 50 times safer due to the public transportation, much healthier, much more convenient and affordable. And these are going to be very desirable places to live. And that's where the workforce is going to go. That's where companies will follow. There's also great value in people finding places where they can live and go about their normal lives without having to worry about sustainability, without having to pay 3 or 4 times as much for organic food, because everything in their environment is designed to heal the world. So you know that just by living in an Edenic city or an Edenicity, you are helping to restore the lost half of life in the surrounding ecosystems. And I've done many episodes that have gone into the details of how cities can provide a much better lifestyle while taking the load off of the large landscapes that are currently burdened with highly toxic monocrop agriculture. With good car-free urbanism, public amenities such as transportation are 10 times cheaper, and with multifamily housing such as apartments and townhouses built at scale, it can be very affordable for young people, as it is in cities such as Vienna, which have made that a policy for over 100 years. Access to local organic food, clean air and water, again, good for reproductive health. And then finally, cities can attract talent by providing affordable education and healthcare, as well as transportation and housing. These are the large-scale forces that are shaping cities, whether they know them or not, and for which Edenicity provides an upgrade path. If you want to learn more about Edenicity, check out this video. You can also download the reference design. And as always, thanks so much to the patrons for supporting this work. Take care, stay green, see you next time.